Yeah, well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for coming out at the lunch hour. Thank you, Philip and Helena and everyone else behind the scenes for setting this up, and I particularly appreciate rescheduling that we did from May. That's a lot of extra work on your part, so appreciate that. So this talk is slightly different than I'd intended originally. I was going to do my best to cram these two papers together. They really need to be two separate talks with kind of an overarching, here's sort of my approach to engaging this area from my academic and consulting lens. I started doing that and realized it would be about an hour and a half if I did that. So what I decided to do instead is to present the paper that I think most needs to be presented. It's kind of, more kind of conceptually dense, which is the bottled water paper, and leave the other one for Q&A, and I'm happy to talk all night long about that one as well. But instead, I wanted to, so that gives me a little bit of time to play with at the front end, and what I wanted to do is take up a question that that the sponsors of the series ask, I think, all their speakers, and we're pushing on, I think, back in April, May, to make clear in the abstract. And it's, Doug, what's your model of social change? And I've been asked that question before. I remember it seems to be a popular question, like in the not-for-profit world and activist world. I was at the Rockefeller Foundation like 4 years ago pitching a project there, and they said, well, so what's your model of social change? That's a really complex question. I can give you a really quick glib answer, because otherwise we're going to be here all day. It's a very, it's kind of a frustrating question that you just sort of pass over. But the more I sort of reflected on, that this audience, you really want to know, like, what's, take it up to the meta level and let me understand what you think. It was really, really kind of fortuitous, because I've never, I think, a very different approach than most people trying to develop good ideas for, whichever kind of environmental sustainability issue or meta issue at the societal level you want to work on. And I kind of know it's different, but I've never sort of been forced to articulate it. So I'm going to try at the beginning of this presentation to sort of take you through that difference, and I'll do it in as provocative way as I can to keep your attention while you're eating your lunch. So my motivation, I used to have the origin of this research was back in 2008 when I was over in the UK and becoming very frustrated looking at how there's this great, political opportunity, as the kind of politics, social movements folks would look at it, across every dimension. Major legislation should happen, and then I was watching, Al Gore's Alliance for Climate Protection, all the big green doing what I thought was just tragically bad marketing, sitting on, in the peanut gallery, and I thought, well, there's no way, nobody even knows who I am, they're not going to believe me, but at least I can start researching this and develop, better models for the next time around, which is now. So that's where I got started, and my original talk that I gave back then was, why is there no American climate movement? Which really ticks people off, because, there are people in the movement, and they say, well, but from de facto, there's no movement because there was no pressure. It was all behind the scenes, cap and trade, negotiating with business and the big greens. So that's what I meant by it, and I'm trying to explain it. More broadly, as I've gotten deeper into it and looked at not just climate but other areas, there's a big paradigm problem, I believe. And so to set it up in the most sort of provocative way, the failures of sustainable society economy efforts over many years are due in significant part to poor strategy. If we're to succeed, we need to approach strategy very differently and get organizations and resources aligned behind these new strategies. So this is exactly opposite what, say, Bill McKibben says, the big guys have all the money, we have people power. We have maybe not as much money, but there's been a lot of money put against environment over the last decade, not as much as the other guys, but it's been invested in the wrong way, I would argue, and that's who knows if we, the extent to which we would do better, but there's a huge, huge failure of strategy that until we get right, doesn't matter how many folks are in the street, doesn't matter how much money, Back then we had Al Gore raising $300 million for his war chest, all misspent in my view. Now we have Tom Steyer, the new, money guy with his $50 million in this last election, which didn't do much. It actually probably hurt in my state of Colorado. So that's, I'm really focused on why are we progressives so bad at strategy is the basic question. And I come at this being a very careful student of the right, who are really good strategists. And if you look at what's happened over the last 40 years and the whole movement, the creation of the neoliberal state we live in, we sort of do it the best. They're pretty good in Australia and Canada increasingly, but we kind of lead the way in branding that state. They're good at it. It was very strategic and organized, and here we are. Which leads me to sort of rephrasing the question, which is, we've got to get beyond this, what's your theory of social change? Which is not the right question to ask, I'll argue in the end. Okay. So that gets your attention, right? Okay, good. All right, so let me quickly, these are really, quick and dirty last 3 days slides, so they're not going to look pretty, but hopefully I'll be able to communicate. So what is our, where do our strategies come from? What are they right now? And this is sort of my mapping, lay of the land for environment, sustainability, climate. So you start in the trenches with the organizations actually trying to do work to building and launching the campaigns, movement organizations, from 350 all the way down to hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller groups around the country. When you look at their strategies, models, they're under-resourced, they don't have time to go sit back, study, analyze. It's these very quick analogies. Oh, in the civil rights movements, they had protest, let's protest. It's literally on that kind of level. It's a very quick, simple, let's act. Nobody else is, we don't see EDF doing anything, let's get out in the street and do something and start and see what works. So it's kind of an, prototyping model, let's get out in the street, which is sort of how 350 started. But I would include, Naomi Klein and her new book in that. I would include, Chris Hayes and his influential essay in The Nation, looking at slavery and comparing it to climate. All of that kind of discourse. When you step back from it and sort of have time, the luxury to sort of analyze and be, grounded in all the different disciplines that could inform strategy, you can say, and this isn't a, it's not a damning critique. These are the people actually sacrificing their time to do this. But analytically, there are lots of faulty inferences being made. Same thing happened back with cap and trade. You'll recall the faulty inferences were, this is like World War II. This is like Apollo. This is like the Marshall Plan. This is like, choose your war, post-war metaphor. All of them badly distorting what the right strategy should be, simply by choosing the wrong analogy without carefully thinking through why that makes sense. So we need to help these guys. These are the people who are actually doing the hard work and making the sacrifice. So along comes what I'll call theory land. These are the people who haven't committed to taking it to the streets. Some people do, but most of us don't. But we think we have some pretty smart ideas. We're expert in a particular discipline. We're a big thinker. We're philosophers. We're humanities. Novelists. I can take the ideas of history and help you with how this movement should come, how this thing should coalesce. Some classic examples where mostly I'm focusing on climate, though the paper I'll give doesn't sort of tangentially climate. Last decade, actually more than a decade, 15 years, another thing that sort of got me all sort of wound up in wanting to do this work is to watch how all the liberal left groups, Democratic Party and climate and everything, latched on to George Lakoff framing. that was it. Here, oh, we've got the answer. The other guys have, what's his name, who's their framing guy, who's the... Lutz. So here, Lakoff's our guy. So framing, I'm sure some of you know, Lakoff did not invent framing. Marketers have been doing framing for 100 years, and probably informally before that, formalized as part, it's a basic generic tool of marketing forever. There's a very well-developed sociological literature on framing. I know you had David Snow here earlier, and he wrote some influential papers on framing and sociology, looking at media framing. Bill Gamson here in Boston saying, 25, 30 years ago, that added to our knowledge, kind of conceptual knowledge of framing, and others that aren't well known in kind of activist circles. So there's lots of kind of social science ideas that percolate into, on the ground, how we do framing. So it's one technique. You can do it well or usually not so well. And I would say, Lakoff is a brilliant linguist from a very particular school of structural linguistics, which is really looking at universals, which when you get to marketing, universals don't help much. Archetypes, that stuff, it's way too general, way too vague. It's just a very basic problem. So actually, he's got a brilliant guy and can add insights to, I'm sure, some problems. But marketing and politics is probably the way you don't want to go. But because of the way that we think about strategy on the progressive, liberal, left, whatever you want to call it side, that we go to the academics and say, give us some, our ideas aren't working, give us, and he wrote some really nice books. He started an institute, he got together with those breakthrough guys, they sold framing around the country. And we bought into it and wasted a lot of time because of it. Same thing now is happening with, and these, everybody, I'm sure George Lakoff, I've never met him, but has every good intention, but he's not a strategist, and he's doing strategy. Behavioral science today, so everybody now is on climate, is applying like Common and Tversky heuristics and showing why climate is such a difficult problem. It's true, but that doesn't get you to a strategy. I mean, you can't connect the dots to a strategy. Some of the discussion here, and hopefully will influence how you guys think about that, is the same thing. Let's explore some of these big ideas. So the discussion that the Institute has been sponsoring for the last year, internet online posting discussion is the same. So it's the same thing, and everybody does this. This isn't a damning critique. This is our model. This is our paradigm. Well, let's go find a better idea. We better think if our big ideas aren't working, let's get some better big ideas. And so we try. We say offer that advice. So have George Lakoff comes and presents to 350 and says, here's what you should do. Or there's a guy at Yale Law School now who's doing the same thing. I can't remember his name. The guy at Stanford who's the psychologist giving. So they're all doing interesting, important research. No problem, but there's something missing in this space between theory land and in the trenches. And that. So let me just describe. So the weaknesses, once again, in hindsight, coming from the world I come in, when you start looking at why these ideas don't work, they're super generic, they need to be specified. There's a theory mismatch. There's hundreds of big ideas, thousands. Why this one? So we need to think of a portfolio of big ideas and they can inform, but it's not, let me wave my idea and it's, here it is, and this is the right one. It's very myopic. It's not just one idea. It's, working with a number of ideas toward a particular strategic goal. It's just, there's no sort of strategic focus driving the working with theory here, and there's a lot of work to be done to use the theories properly. So what happens for those who are really good at doing marketing politics, marketing movements? You look to the political right, because they are pretty good at it. And our bad misunderstanding of it is thinking that it's just, that guy, that framing guy does his little tricks with focus groups, that's everything. That's very marginal, tactical, moving, nudging an issue back and forth. The real work of it is this massive marketing machine with all these PR firms and think tanks and media wrapped in that has been working extremely effectively doing a kind of political marketing strategy, a political movement strategy for the last 40 years. And that's where the action is. this is it. So, the big ideas they've already informed this. We've left the world of big ideas. There's a great little story in The Guardian yesterday where somebody revealed the PR plan for the Plan B, TransCanada's Plan B pipeline for the East Coast pipeline. It's, Edelman, one of the huge PR firms in the world, they're working on it. All these big PR firms are using all the best marketing tools, and somebody, leaked this, but read through it, it's online. It's a, nice 40, 50-page document. It's not brilliant, but it'll show you how you do strategy to do this kind of stuff, and we don't do it at all. So that's, let's call it the dark arts, is what they do really well and we're missing out on. So what are the dark arts? So I'm not going to give a marketing or branding seminar here, but just the kind of thinking. You systematically analyze the market, a political market, it's the same thing, Citizens can be thought of as the same thing as consumers. The opposition, you need to study how they're working, and all from a marketing branding lens. There's a climate brand out there. There's an opposition to it. How does that work? Identify the key marketing issues. What's keeping our brand? What's keeping the climate brand or your choice from winning? Across which segments? Why? What's the strategy that we're going to use specifically to overcome those barriers? Informed by, so we're being very smart about these big ideas, but we're leaving them behind. We're using them very selectively, and we're adapting them dramatically for our own purposes. And then finally, once we have a strategy, then let's get it out there and work very carefully on executional ideas across. We have a whole portfolio of stuff we do in marketing. Which of these channels, avenues shall we use? What does the creative look like? All informed by a very specific strategy, working very carefully with that. So you get to something like, the People's Climate March. There's no, it's not, forget everything else. I think it was not the right investment of people's time and resource at all. But why does it make sense that a big protest, the gathering that number of people, is the smartest use of resource? Behind what kind of strategic goal? So it's got a very blunt building awareness around climate and showing energy and momentum. There's no idea there. There's no sort of strategic direction, so we waste a lot of time. So the basic, the conclusion from this little mini section, we've been out-marketed because we ignore marketing, so we need to embrace the dark arts as a progressive tool. Progressive marketing, it's not an oxymoron. All right, so, marketing is this, you got to get, it's a real problem because marketing has been used for some really crappy purposes historically, but it's just a tool. It's a technology, and we need to sort of know the best tools, technologies. So, moving into sort of my stuff, so I was a brand manager way back when, didn't like it much. Got a doctorate, spent all of my time running as far away from marketing as I could, because theory is much more fun and much more interesting, and did that for about 15 years, sociology, anthropology, media studies, cultural theory, really a mutt of those disciplines, and enjoyed not being part of it, but I came to the conclusion about 15 years ago that actually it was the thing that I left behind where I could actually make a difference, that gap is actually where I needed to head back to. So I started with more commercial branding focus, just because I was at Harvard and it was easy to study and that's what you got kind of credit for. But it was looking at social mission companies too, and developed a model I call cultural branding. So it's I think a very sophisticated model for certain kinds of branding that actually align exactly with, a lot of it was informed by politics and movements. So it's not really good for selling Coke or Pepsi, though I've used it to do so. It's really made for big, culturally significant, identity affirming or disconfirming ideas, things, people, whatever. A climate is much more of that than a can of soda. So I've continued to work on that, and increasingly been working with social enterprises, which I originally thought was where I wanted to focus my attention. So I've done big consulting projects with all these companies, developed, freelancers union we developed Freelancers Union, worked with Ben & Jerry's for a decade. So I mean, these are great projects on their own, but they also allow me to think very carefully about how to apply kind of more commercial tools into the land of social movements a bit. And now I'm really pushing across this line, and I think all those social enterprises are fantastic, but it's incremental. They're sort of working on the riding the coattails of movements. I mean, if you look at through my model, it's basically movements, subcultures are other drivers. You look at where Ben & Jerry's comes from, all these others, it's coming out of movement activity really, and the movements are really where the action is, and that's where we have the least sophistication with these kind of tools. So that's where we really need to be focusing. So I started up this lonely solo pro bono, I'm calling Planet Strategy, trying to make a gloomy enterprise a little more cheerful with a nice logo. And with the hopes of doing this kind of work. Okay, so what is it? So what I've worked on the last 24 hours is how can I explain what I do and how it's different from that? So this is what I was just critiquing, right? We have big ideas, you name the discipline, could be a novelist, could be a sociologist, could be whatever. Let me tell you, we have this big gap. We draw direct inferences from our own theory, no additional work needed. I'm implying there's a bunch of work needed, so I want to give you sort of a flavor for what I try and do in my work, and kind of what I'm doing across these two papers, what I'm trying to do on climate strategy as well. So we begin with basic marketing strategy tools, which are half of the way there. They're not built for speed for this kind of stuff, but they're, it's the right sort of general definition of the toolkit and so forth. My cultural branding piece gets us much, much closer to what we need, I think. And then you start studying these real issues. We need cases. We need to say, let's go in and find out how I can improve that model. So we're just in strategy land. We're not, forget big ideas for now. I mean, that strategy was, the existing models were informed by big ideas at one point, but they exist. We don't need to go back to sort of first principles. They exist. Look at the real issue, what is the implicit strategy model, and start studying it and see, who wins, who loses. Let's explain the wins. Let's explain why, why the loss came out that way. So really looking with that sort of framework, looking closely at cases, using kind of very best academic methods to study these carefully, and get informed very selectively by theory that you need to improve this marketing strategy model. So it's not, I'm not taking the big theory up here and saying, oh yes, well let's do some linguistics, but it's super helpful. You can't really build the right model unless you're informed, unless you've been able to sort of think through the world from a lens of cultural politics and institutions, and you need all those tools, but that's not the end. So it's sort of, going back and forth and iterating with the case, trying to build out the theory, build out the model, and you keep doing it until you're sort of there. As you explain a number of cases, you generalize to a strategy framework, and you're improving the theory to the point where you say, I've got a better theory than what they have on the ground. That's the model. It should be, I can help them. I know from this analysis that this strategy model will get you to better solutions than what they've tried or what they're thinking about. And that's when you start really thinking about application. So you need to go through a long process, all at the level of strategy, before you even should be talking to an activist, in my view. So there's lots of bad advice circulating because we're not really systematically building out strategy in this kind of way. And that's just the beginning. So a real machine that does this kind of the dark arts well starts looking carefully. It's a probe and learn incubator sort of idea. You're putting out, working with new strategy frameworks for particular issues. Every issue sort of domain needs a different strategic framework. Applying it, studying it again, learning from it, and evolving it. And that's how marketing is done in the business world, and that's how the right has been doing it too, I would argue, and this is something like this is what we need to do. None of this exists. We don't even think this way. In the whole, I can't, not just environment, but I can't name a space of sort of social change, politics, anywhere on the liberal left, progressive side that even thinks of the world this way. All right, so that's what I try and do. So it's a lonely enterprise. So let's go to look at climate, which is what I'm focused on. So first of all, we need to, climate is so difficult because it's everywhere. And so getting strategic focus, it's, we started out studying why activists, environmental activists on the ground doing stuff on, clean water or whatever, aren't working on climate, and 99% of them aren't. Why? And it's so hard to get your head around and sort of figure out where do I intervene and how, so just sorting out strategically how we engage, I think, is really important. So to simplify, I sort it out this way: a macro level, a meso level, and a micro level. So I say, macro level, we have to look at what's the one big, strategy is about focus. Our huge problem today is because we have no strategy, we have no focus, so there's about 300 different initiatives on climate, and none of them are going to work because there's 300 different initiatives on climate. And this is part of the logic of, you read the communications director at 350 said, we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket, we just got to be doing lots of things, which is exactly, it's anti-strategic. We have to pick our bets, make the right bet, but it's got to be, smart. It's got to be based on real analysis. The big bet we know. I mean, we can discuss later, is this the right bet? But for the last at least decade, 20 years, arguably, we know it's an externality. If you try Keystone or whatever else, you're putting your finger in 7,000 holes in the dike, and there are going to be new holes tomorrow. The only way, at the first instance, it's not the only part, but the first instance, we have to price the externality. We need a huge carbon tax, and maybe methane too, and it's got to be progressive tax. Again, there's some basic issues around that. So some kind of tax and refund, call it what you want, fee and dividend, has different names. But that's, it's inarguable. I mean, I think it's, and so read, what James Hansen wrote in his book, and a lot of people have suggested this, and I think if we're going to make one bet, something that will actually move the needle in the next 5 years and actually convince the Chinas and Indias to go farther than kind of voluntary sort of things, this is it. So we should be putting, 3/4 of our attention up there now. Let's get that done. That's job one. Meso level, so there's a lot of heterogeneity behind pricing mechanisms because these markets are institutionalized to create unsustainable consumption. So the way I define this is we'll get into the bottled water paper. Instead of thinking about consumers and how can we change consumer behavior, it's a meso level, how can we change markets and make them sustainable. And then the micro level, where we start thinking about another way of thinking about consumers and more of sort of new models, is important too, because those are the models for change that we need to seed and grow. And here I think about sustainable subcultures, and we really need to think strategically about how can we innovate alternatives that can scale. And we've had lots of great subcultures over 100 years that never have posed much of a threat to the dominant model. So there's another kind of question there. All right. So I'm trying to work, so we need better strategy on all these areas. I'm trying to do a little bit in all of them. So the bottled water paper I'll talk about today is this meso level, which I think, this I think is pretty important because it's never been defined in this way. It's usually, so I'm trying to replace the idea of sustainable consumption as a whole, really, and start thinking about sustainable markets, and I'll explain that today. The Main Street paper that Helena talked about is here, and it's, I think you read the paper, and I think it's a reset away from upper middle class, subcultures that really resonate with me. I love everything that's going on in sort of what I call sustainable bohemia, but I still live in a nice house. I travel to Europe. I'm not on the vanguard. So who is, and how can we incentivize that is really important. And then I'm doing, most of my attention right now is on a new strategy for a climate movement to pass a $200 carbon tax, but I'm not quite done yet. So next time. So that's kind of the lay of the land. And I think sorting that out and saying, okay, I'm going to work on markets, and here's the framework I'm going to use, and that's different than a climate campaigning model, and that's different than subcultures that we want to seed and grow. Just, you know, it just sort of helps sort, because these things get conflated all the time. Just in talking about sustainable consumption, all three get conflated. All right, so meso. So this is the paper, which I'll try and get through quickly so we have time for discussion. I'll assume you read some of it. So this is the title of the paper, Constructing Sustainable Consumption from Ethical Values to the Cultural Transformation of Unsustainable Markets. Sustainable consumption has received enormous attention. All of you know that. I'm not going to go through, but it has been, you know, certainly since Rio, it's just been a huge institutional push in educational institutions, NGOs, foundations. Let's figure out the sustainable consumption thing and make it happen. Big state programs, whole thing. So you'll see, as you know, my point of view is that a lot of that effort we need to redirect. It's not working. Two dominant strategies. I'm not going to go through in great detail, but I read the paper. I call them ethical transformation, sort of the great transformation kinds of ideas, and ethical campaigning that really go after specifically, you know, one agenda item with the idea that that will seed a greater focus. So it's just kind of, you know, shotgun, you know, the whole holistic sort of systems level versus a narrow focus. But what I argue is that, you know, there's no lack of work on this. There's no lack of really smart people, dedicated people doing creative work, but it's not helping. So we should, instead of pushing harder and harder and harder on the same ideas, we should think, step back, look at the lay of the land, what's actually happened using these strategies since Rio, not much, and at least trial. We don't have to take every resource away from this. You believe some of these things are working, but certainly explore different approaches. So to get there, figure out, you know, what is it about this approach that isn't working? And so I go in the paper, I talk about how these are based. So here we get into sort of the big theory land, and it's where it's kind of helpful, right? They're all based in this paradigm I call ethical values. Some people sort of spell it out. Most it's kind of implied. And so in the beginning of the paper, I unpack what is that? What are those sort of unspoken paradigm? It kind of comes out of this sort of a psychological kind of model that was it's interesting because it was a parallel kind of model was popular in marketing in the 60s and 70s and just kind of went away. It just doesn't. People were looking for the master model, the general model of consumer behavior, you know, values, attitudes, behaviors sort of model, and it just doesn't work. I wrote a paper in the 90s critiquing it and showing why it doesn't work. Other people have done the same. It's just, you know, it's sort of dead in the water, but yet at the same time it's, you know, it's dying in marketing. It becomes the, you know, the only way that we think about saving the world. It's kind of tragic in some ways. So focus on consumer choice, bracket out technological and economic structuring. Choices are, I'm just going to read this out so we have time. It's all in the paper in more detail. Choices are shaped by consumerism, so that's the big kind of, there's cultural idea or ideology that a lot of us have written about and talked about. A set of abstract personal values that orients our lives around consumption. These values, materialism, possessive individualism, etc., structure our unsustainable consumption choices and practices across a wide range of categories. So we also have this, it's a consumerist ideology that most, you know, most people, most of the time in Western society, certainly, you know, lower middle, above, deeply drink the Kool-Aid, and that's a key problem. So we blame ourselves. We've adopted bad ethics. Let's change our ethical systems. Or we blame companies. They've seduced us with their marketing to adopt bad ethics, so fight them, and then that'll allow us to change our ethics, some version of that. Regardless, sustainable consumption requires value transformation, importing ethical systems from other spheres, religion, philosophy, radical ecology, feminism, etc. Okay, so this is kind of this sort of psychological, again, attitude, value attitude, behavior kind of models. They're everywhere, and there's no evidence that they work. So people have looked empirically in the environment to show, you know, where's the effect, and they can't find it. And people are so frustrated. It must be a methods problem. But it's just assumed. So Anthony Lazarowicz is, you know, one of the most influential environmental psych guys who does all the surveys for Yale. Sure, very smart guy, but very wedded to this paradigm, writes a review article and says, most advocates of sustainable development recognize the need for changes in human values, attitudes, and behaviors in order to achieve this. So he's just saying, this is it. You know, we know that's the basis, but let's figure out. So the paradigm just informs his whole review of the field. There's no other choice. You find it everywhere. So Tim Jackson, famous influential book, same thing. Read through that. He sort of references the sociocultural guys, sort of, but his model is the same. Bill McKibben's book, you know, the deep earth and kind of deep economy stuff. It's all based on the same kind of logic. So we need to rethink the problem. There's kind of this levels of intervention, confusion going on that, based on what I just described. Consumerism is surely a cause of unsustainable consumption. So we're not saying consumerism doesn't exist. It surely exists. And so a possible path towards sustainability is to transform values. I would call it ideology. It's locked into systems of power. If we call it values, we totally miss how to change it. But that's, if we're not going after those systems of power, this is a 100-year project. If we're just doing it, if it's just a culturalist project, maybe it's a 1,000-year project. You have to look at, you know, politics, economy, institutions, who has power and who doesn't. Otherwise, you're missing the boat. But anyway, it's a big. That's great if you're shooting for your grandkids. But if we need to change the world now in the next 5 or 10 years, it's not the right lens. So focusing on consumerism, though, all is not lost because it hides this great heterogeneity in sustainability. There's lots of unsustainability locked into all of our different institutions, you know, whether it's agriculture, transport, or, you know, urban space, et cetera. It's all there, and pricing will have a huge, you know, impact if we can do that. But it's still a huge amount of work to be done, I would say, at the market level. And to make that argument that it's not consumption, it's markets, I give, you know, various folks on markets, I give the example of SUVs in the book. And I was actually part of the class action suit against Ford back in the day. I know quite a bit about the whole SUV thing. And what's really interesting is that market took off, huge environmental impact. People switched from, you know, pretty, you know, relatively fuel efficient station wagons and kiddie vans to very inefficient but very profitable SUVs in masses, and they were upper middle class people. These were expensive things. And these are all people attitudinally, if you looked at surveys, all said they were environmentalists, very concerned about climate, et cetera. You know, basic kind of obvious piece of data, you know, how do you sort of maintain that theory given this? It just, you know, it just doesn't work. So instead we have to think of how could we have intervened in the market for automobiles, transport more broadly, such that that wouldn't have happened, or, you know, some other more proactive goal. So that's where you get this shift, as I sort of go through, from kind of a consumption lens, consumer lens, to a market lens. So this new, so I'm saying, let's think in this other paradigm, market construction. So here's where the big ideas really help. So I've, you know, dabbled enough across different areas looking for theories that can be helpful in picking, you know, trying to become reasonably smart in ones that are. And along the way, you know, there's a lot of interesting stuff. I've always been fascinated by kind of institutional levels of analysis in sociology, STS, it's now in management theory, that talks about more of a social constructionist sort of way of looking at institutions. And this is actually, you start thinking through the problem, that's the toolkit we need here. So you couldn't pick a single paper in any of these areas and say, oh, let me slap that onto to this problem, case solved. It's not even close. There's all that middle ground research and theory building work to do, but they're hugely informative ways of thinking that busts you out of that old paradigm, values, attitudes, behaviors, and helps you think in what I think is a much more powerful way. So I start talking about the construction of unsustainability. I've got 3 minutes, so I'm going to let you read through this and get to the model itself. So here's the studies on bottled water. So I start and look at, I chose bottled water because it's a nice self-contained area. There was huge campaigning around bottled water for about 4 or 5 years. And I see that drinking. They'll be recycled though, I'm sure. It was just a little test we were doing at the entrance. So there's huge sort of campaigning, interest around it, and it was clear by the time I decided to do the study that it hadn't worked. So it's a perfect case to like figure out how come, and it should, and it's a great case because it should have worked. It's probably the easiest, you know, it's a lot easier than climate, all right? So you start out, what are the theories out there? So the typical theory, this was hugely, you know, I don't know how many, 2-3 million hits. You know, Annie Leonard's Story of Stuff, this was, I think, the second, her, you know, sequel. The bad guys, the big companies brainwashing us to drink bottled water. Let's be against them and drink tap water. So that's the theory, and that's what you know, she's an activist, really. She used to work Greenpeace, now runs Greenpeace, doing really powerful films, but with no analysis. So this is, you know, theory on the street again, that's really taking us, all the best intention, taking us in the wrong direction. So if this is the real issue, we got to, you know, yell at Coke and Pepsi and Nestle, saying quit brainwashing us, and then get everybody to get excited about tap water. So there wasn't that much yelling at those guys. Instead, the whole campaign was based on getting everybody to drink tap water, right? So that's what I'm analyzing. So to do this kind of study, you want to go back and really do kind of a careful history, looking at culture, social, institutional dimensions, and try and see, you know, why it is, in this case, that this kind of intervention didn't work, and explain what other ones might. So started out looking at the market for water. It was exploding throughout the 90s, 2000s, shifting toward ready-to-drink sizes, all sorts of environmental issues I'm not going to go through, but it's 0.3% of all US fossil fuels are in bottled water, which is pretty amazing. Technological innovation plays an important role. We didn't have the right bottles before the 80s, but we didn't have to drink them, so how does the market get constructed? So the story I tell is this, very quickly, 90-second version. So at first, there was a real problem. There was huge underfunding of water filtration, purification systems for public water supplies around the country. It's deteriorating. It gets a D just like the bridges do. So there really is, you know, something we should worry about, and it's caused by this massive underfunding of, you know, key public goods. Okay. Two, but this is, you know, there was bad public water 50 years ago too, so, or 75 years ago. What really set this off was this catalyzing, it's got a risk society incident, if you know Ulrich Beck's sort of ideas around that. This is a classic example where there's a Cryptosporidium outbreak in Milwaukee, 69 people dying from drinking the water. Huge media thing, you know, showing people going to Chicago, filling up water, hauling it back to Milwaukee. Changes the whole discourse. So we're really looking at the discourse in the country, the whole media discourse and the way it trickles down into public discussions and so forth. Hugely important. It gets massively amplified. The people who really created the problem, the market for bottled water, were the NGOs. NRDC and this is Environmental Working Group made their name with their original reports on tap water, the new scourge, and NRDC too. So they're amplifying this kind of fear, this, you know, huge panic that would have died, but they jumped on it and institutionalized it. They're issuing annual reports that get put out in the New York Times and so forth. So here are the culprits initially. We're not letting the companies off the hook though. Culturally, we have this, you know, Jane Brody told all Americans should drink 8 glasses of water a day. It was totally wrong. She misread it as 8 glasses of water equivalent, which could be in your vegetables. But we all started believing it, and so we started carrying water everywhere. So this didn't help because it had to be on the go, right? So it's hard to tap water on the go is hard. Coke and Pepsi and Nestle weren't first movers here. They sat around and waited because it was stealing business from their sodas. So once it started cannibalizing business and looked like a decent business, they came rushing in and took it over because they own all the infrastructure. They can dominate these markets easily, so they could just sit and wait. So they're parasites coming in, new market, boom, put the vending machines everywhere. They're making as much money on this now as they do Coke, so who cares? It's a great business. The media discourse and the marketing all kind of combine to create this new ideology of safe drinking water. So now we just tap water is like, ooh, you taste a little chlorine in it, ooh. That's not good water. And we have to have, I don't have like a $1,000 purification system in my house. I can't, you know, then I'm drinking a bottled water. So there's this whole new aesthetic, you know, around, and hedonics around bottled water that's really important. And then the incumbents come in, and they're going to, now that it's a good market, they're going to protect the heck out of it. So, you know, you're worrying about the plastic, which is sustainable. We're making bottles out of plants, while backstage ensuring that the unsustainable consumption continues. So the one way you can actually do something about this is recycling. We recycle 15% of plastic bottles, soda, water. When you put a 10-cent deposit on it, it goes up to 80. Very simple, and there's a real high, 70% energy recapture, so it's pretty good. I'm out of time, so we're going to go real fast now. Give me about 3 more minutes, and I'll finish, maybe 4. So you have Coke, Pepsi, Nestle all running these. Same thing with sugar, right? They're running these, you know, huge campaigns against sugar. Well, you know, backstage, front stage. Okay, so that's what's going on. So let me show you quickly. So I'm analyzing it at the case level, and then I'm conceptualizing. Say, so what's the model here? Still at the case level, and then I'm going to generalize to a kind of institutional model that maybe we can use for things other than bottled water. So let me just build this up. So look at this kind of socio-political technical structuring. You know, we have crappy water because we're not investing in public water. We have the media discourse picking it up, market infrastructure, all the companies coming in and making it ubiquitous everywhere, consumer practices, us developing a fondness and habituated attachment to having cases of bottled water everywhere we go, all constructs this market level ideology. This is just for bottled water. This isn't consumerism, this is bottled water. And we have to analyze at this level to understand these constructed benefits that that all these actors are culpable. Not just the companies are there for sure, and everybody else. Constructing this market where the unsustainability is in the market. It's been constructed, none of these companies intended to create all these effects of plastic. PET was the only bottle they could use. People liked it. The market developed. They didn't do it first. So it's, you know, but once it's there and they're built in the market, there's a lot of people who want it to stay that way. They're incumbents. Consumers like it. Environmental Working Group likes issuing reports and getting lots of new members. You know, so everybody likes it. So I developed some terms that are helpful. Talk about ideological lock-in. So we have all these kind of path dependency effects. We talk about in economics and institutions. So there's a cultural level of that too that's happening here that we have to be very cognizant of. And this is a term I developed in my commercial work, cultural code inflation, that applies here too. So moving on. So there was a big campaign, 20-second version of it. Should be great. It's a really easy one. It's front stage. You know, it's not hidden backstage. It's not about mining practices. It's right in front of you. It's a huge aesthetic problem. We see the horrible pictures of plastic pollution. It's easy to do. We can actually save money by using tap. If there's a problem that we should be able to campaign against, it's this one. So this is a very conservative case. It's like, you know, something really is busted here. So we had all these take back the tap campaigns, big efforts, everybody's involved. We're going to kick this, win this one. And I should have put the latest data, but it goes up from there. So there was a little blip that was totally recession, and then it's, you know, the consumption per capita goes up. So it had no effect. You know, it's kind of hard to parse out the recession effect and the campaign effect, but certainly if you look at the curve, you would had no effect. So that leads us to say, what's a better strategy model? What happened here? Why was it wrong? So basically, we were trying to tell consumers to reject this new market ideology and just go drink tap water, even though they need water on the move, because I need my 8 glasses a day. I know, I've been told by Environmental Working Group, I trust very much, that there's a chance there's Cryptosporidium in here. I don't want to do that. And the taste, I mean, yuck, chlorine. So we're just saying, make a big sacrifice and take, you know, risk your life and your family's life. You know, it's just not working. Huge inconvenience. So we have to think, what are real interventions that could work? So you can kind of use the model and think through what, you know, how could we, you know, and so I end the paper with just 2 examples. So one is kind of simple idea, better than bottled. So if people aren't going to change their taste, so we have to take this new, which is better water, safer water, but, you know, scale it and have just real simple, use all the, you know, all the trappings of pure water that have been developed by the industry, and brand a new public water system, the new water fountains, and have them everywhere. And then once we introduce them, we can start a campaign and tell people how much money they're wasting. This is actually better than bottled. So we can set a higher, it's easier to set a higher standard than Dasani. And so it's easy, we can outdo them. We can take the market from them. It's sort of like the, with internet today in public, is it Knoxville that's doing that, Nashville, one of the, same kind of idea. Like they're making a bunch of money for a product that's not that hard to make. As a public good, it works much better. Let's take it. Another idea, more kind of conflicting, more classic campaign, why hasn't anybody done this, is just outing, there's a huge contradiction inside, outside of what these water companies are doing. Sustainable outside, campaigning against recycling bills inside. So, this took me all of like 15 minutes to put together, but something like this. We come up with a fake name, the Americans for Plastic Pollution. Please don't recycle. This is the Pacific Patch, Americans only recycle 15% of their plastic bottles. We just don't get it done because it's a hassle. The only way we'll change is put a small deposit fee on the bottles. If we get 10 cents back for each bottle, we increase our recycling rate to 80%. But we also might buy a little less water with that deposit added. So we think it's better just to leave things where they are. We're the big water companies, and we hope that you'll continue to view our products pure and hopefully even green. So just playing with the discourse. This is the kind of thing that works great on social media. Not that hard. But you have to do the analysis to know, where those Achilles heels are and start applying the dark arts. So this is an example of the progressive dark arts that I started out with. In my view, the Great Transition is a grand marketing battle waged across the pillars of society, economic, ideological, political, institutional. It's a small, feisty, entrepreneurial idea that's trying to overcome one of the most powerful interests in the world. We can't all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and hope things are going to change. It's a battle at the core, just like any market is, but this is stakes are higher, bigger market. We need sophisticated marketing strategy frameworks designed to drive this transition. We must build strategies by applying these frameworks via nuanced and systematic research, concepting, et cetera, the marketing piece. And we must build political and market movements that align around these. All these cats doing all their movement-y stuff, that's maybe even the hardest part, is getting them to buy in and organize around it. So I'll leave you with the dark part of the dark arts thing, which is right now we're dominated by very simplistic ideas, myopic social science. I've got some big ideas, try it, or in the trenches, bad theories, bad analogies. Leaders on the activist side certainly aren't for marketing. They don't get it. Some are absolutely repulsed by the idea and would never want to even hear this lecture. We're more fragmented than ever on the ground. We tried the big integrative stuff, and people think, well, we failed getting together, so everybody's kind of doing their own thing. So that's it. Stop there.